My grandfather was a man of order. Everything in his mansion had a purpose, a place, and a rule attached to it, especially his grand piano. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a relic of his late wife, untouched for years. No one, and I mean no one, dared to touch it, until the day his young nurse thought no one was watching. What she didn't know is that he was standing silently behind the door, listening. What happened next? That's what changed everything, not just for her, but for our entire family. Enjoy the story. My grandfather wasn't always a millionaire. In fact, most of his youth was spent in the dusty corners of poverty, selling newspapers on the street while dreaming of owning just a single pair of polished shoes. But life, in all its strange and mysterious turns, gave him a different script. He became a successful composer in his 30s, not for fame, but because music was the only place where he could truly breathe. He met my grandmother in a jazz bar, and the moment she sang one of his songs without knowing he was the author, he swore he'd marry her. And he did. Their life was filled with music, laughter, and a deep sacred silence around one thing: the piano. After she died, that piano turned into a monument. He never played again, never allowed anyone to touch it. It was her voice, frozen in ivory keys. Over the years, nurses came and went. Some left because of his stubbornness. Others stayed long enough to collect a check and move on. But then came Eliza, young, soft-spoken, with eyes that carried too much sadness for someone her age. She didn't talk much, but she moved like someone who had music trapped inside her bones. I noticed it the first time she walked into the living room. Her glance at the piano lasted too long. I thought it was curiosity, or maybe respect. But now, looking back, I think it was longing. Eliza didn't see the piano as a relic. She saw it as a door she was forbidden to open. And forbidden doors always whisper louder. My grandfather liked her more than he admitted. He'd grumble about how she walked too fast or used too much cinnamon in his coffee, but I caught him smiling when she laughed. Something about her presence softened the air in that cold house. Then came that Tuesday afternoon. I was upstairs organizing some boxes when I heard a sound I hadn't heard in over a decade. A note, just one, then another, then a soft, trembling melody weaving its way through the walls like a ghost trying to speak. I froze. I knew it couldn't be Grandpa. He hadn't touched that piano in years. I crept downstairs, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. Eliza, sitting at the bench, eyes closed, fingers dancing gently on the keys, like she was touching someone she'd lost. And just beyond the archway, my grandfather, motionless, watching, not angry, not even surprised, just still. And in that stillness, something ancient shifted. I thought he'd yell. I thought he'd fire her. But what happened next? I couldn't have imagined it in 1,000 lifetimes. He stepped forward slowly, like a man walking into a memory he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Eliza didn't notice at first. Her eyes were still closed, and her fingers moved with such tenderness that the melody felt like a whisper from another world. It wasn't flashy or loud. She wasn't showing off. She was remembering something, or maybe trying to forget. My grandfather stood behind her, breathing heavily, one trembling hand reaching toward the air, not to touch her, but to feel something only he could recognize. That song, it wasn't one of his, but it carried the same ache, the same pauses, the same kind of grief. When the final note lingered in the room, Eliza opened her eyes and froze. Their eyes met. Her face turned pale. She stood up immediately, stammering apologies, already reaching for her bag. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at the piano, as if it had spoken instead of her. She whispered, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. I know, it was wrong." But he raised a hand gently, signaling her to stop. "No," he said, voice thick and rusty like an old cello. "Don't apologize." It was the first time I'd heard him speak without irritation in months. "That song, where did you learn to play like that?" Eliza looked down, fingers trembling. "My mum, she taught me. Before she passed, we used to play every night." There was silence between them. Not awkward, not cold, but sacred. The kind of silence that honors pain. "Sit," he said, motioning back to the bench. "Play something else." She hesitated. "Please," he added. That word from his mouth was more shocking than any scream could have been. Slowly, she sat. She placed her fingers back on the keys, unsure. But this time, she played one of his compositions. A piece from decades ago that few people even knew existed. She played it like she had lived inside it. Tears welled up in his eyes. I swear I saw his chest heave like something heavy had been resting there for years. And finally, it moved. When she finished, there was no applause, no words, just the sound of him walking over, sitting beside her on the bench, and placing his hand gently over hers. "My wife used to play it like that," he murmured. "You didn't just play the notes. You listened to what they were." Hiding, Eliza tried to smile, but tears spilled down her cheeks. "Music saved me," she whispered. "It's the only thing that never left." My grandfather nodded, swallowing emotion he couldn't name. "Me too," he said. "But after she died, I stopped listening." That was the moment something invisible passed between them. Not romance, not pity, but healing. Two broken hearts, separated by generations, suddenly recognizing each other's wounds. In that quiet afternoon, the piano wasn't a monument anymore. It was a bridge. The days after that were different, subtly at first, like the way sunlight creeps into a room before anyone realizes the curtains have been drawn. My grandfather started coming downstairs more often, not just for meals, but to sit in the living room where the piano stood. Sometimes he'd pretend to read the newspaper while Eliza cleaned nearby, but everyone knew his ears were listening. She never played again without permission, but something unspoken had shifted, like they had entered into a secret truce. It wasn't long before he asked her to play in the evenings. Just one song, then another, and soon it became a ritual. Tuesday nights turned into concerts for two souls who had been surviving in silence. I watched from the hallway, unseen, as he'd lean back in his chair and close his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember, or maybe to feel, for the first time in years, something other than grief. One night, as the music played softly, he turned to her and asked, "Why did you become a nurse?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, then answered quietly, "Because my father was dying, and no one knew how to care for him. I watched him suffer alone. I swore no one else I cared about would feel that." He didn't respond immediately, just nodded, the way men do when their hearts are too full to speak. "You're different," he said. "You listen." That was his highest form of praise. And in that moment, Eliza didn't need a raise or a reference letter. She had been seen not as an employee, but as a person, a mirror even. He began sharing stories not of business or money, but of music, love, and the tiny cracks that never fully healed. He told her about the bar where he met his wife, how she used to hum while watering the garden, and how the house had felt dead since she left. But now there was music again. I don't think either of them expected what would happen next. One afternoon, as Eliza played in the parlor, a letter arrived from the conservatory. She had applied months earlier, more out of fantasy than belief, and had never told a soul. But my grandfather had found the application on the desk one morning, unsigned, incomplete, and without a word. He had mailed it in himself, finishing the rest. When she opened the envelope, she gasped. She had been accepted full scholarship. Her hands trembled. Tears came quickly. "Go," she said, looking at him. "You need me here." But he shook his head. "No, I needed someone to remind me how to live, and you already did that." He stood, slower than usual, walked to his desk, and handed her a small box. Inside was the key to the piano room. "This house was never silent because of the piano," he said. "It was silent because I forgot how to listen. Don't ever stop playing, not for anyone." And with that, she knew she hadn't just healed a man. She had reopened a life. The morning Eliza left for the conservatory, the house felt both heavier and lighter. She didn't take much, just a suitcase, her acceptance letter, and a folded scarf that once belonged to my grandmother, which my grandfather had quietly slipped into her bag without telling anyone. I watched them say goodbye in the foyer. No grand gestures, no emotional speeches, just two people who had shared a sacred silence, now trying to put meaning into words that would never be enough. "Thank you," she whispered. My grandfather simply nodded, but his eyes betrayed him. They were red, not from age, but from everything he never said aloud. As the door closed behind her, he stood still for several minutes. Then, without a word, he walked to the piano, sat down, and placed his hands on the keys. Not to play, just to touch, just to feel what she had felt. And for the first time in over a decade, the silence didn't feel empty, it felt full. That same week, something strange began to happen. My grandfather, who had once scoffed at technology and refused to use anything invented after 1985, asked me how to video call. "I just want to see her play," he said. Once a week, it became a ritual. Every Saturday, he'd sit in his robe, hair neatly combed, face freshly shaved, like he was attending a concert. And Eliza would call from her tiny dorm, room or practice hall, set her phone by the piano, and play something new. Their conversations were brief but meaningful. He'd critique her technique with the precision of a composer, but end each call with, "Keep going, you're almost listening." That was his version of love. Encouragement wrapped in wisdom, softened by time. And I noticed something else. He started composing again. Scraps of music on napkins, on receipts, on the back of newspapers. He hadn't written in years, but now melodies were returning, and so was he. Months passed, and one evening I found a sealed envelope on the piano. It had Eliza's name written in his trembling handwriting. I asked him about it, but he just waved me off. "When the time's right," he said. I didn't press. But weeks later, he didn't show up for the Saturday call. I checked on him and found him peacefully asleep in his armchair, music sheets resting on his chest, the final bars of a song he had titled, "Her Hands on the Keys." He never woke up. The funeral was quiet, just as he would have wanted, but the music was loud. Eliza flew in, wearing the same scarf. When she sat at the piano and opened the envelope, we all held our breath. Inside was a composition, written just for her. At the top, in faded ink, were the words, "You reminded me who I was. Now go remind the world who you are." And in that moment, as her fingers met the keys, we knew she wasn't just playing music. She was finishing a conversation that would echo forever. After the funeral, the house didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a museum of melodies. Everywhere I looked, there were fragments of him, scribbled notes pinned to the fridge, dusty recordings tucked into drawers, and that piano, no longer a shrine of silence but a living monument to memory. Eliza stayed for a few more days before returning to school. Each night, she'd play one of his compositions, her eyes closed, as if trying to catch the last echoes of a man who had spoken more through music than words. I remember one evening, she whispered to me, "I didn't know how much I needed him until he was gone." And I replied, "He didn't know how much he had left to give until he met you." They had saved each other without ever saying it outright. It was a love story, yes, but not the kind people put in romance novels. It was deeper, quieter, and infinitely more rare. A story of healing between souls who had nothing in common but pain. Before she left, Eliza handed me an envelope. "It's for you," she said. "From him." I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter, not long, but devastating. He had written it days before he passed. "To my grandson," it began, "I spent my life building walls to protect myself from losing anyone else. But when you watch someone find life in the very thing you tried to bury, you realize you weren't protecting yourself. You were suffocating. Don't do that. Don't live afraid of love because of what it might cost. Let it in. Let it hurt. Let it heal. And one day, you'll find someone, just like she found this piano, who will show you what you forgot you were missing." The paper shook in my hands as I finished reading it. That was the kind of man he had always been beneath the silence. Not cold, not cruel, just wounded. And now, in his absence, he was speaking louder than he ever had in life. I kept the letter beside my bed, folded and worn from the number of times I reread it. I began noticing the way his presence lingered, not in a haunting way, but in guidance. Like when I touched the piano and the keys felt warm, or when I walked into his study and heard a note in my head that hadn't been played. I started composing, something I hadn't done since I was a child. Not because I wanted to be a musician, but because it made me feel close to him. Eliza and I stayed in touch, through music, through silence, through shared memory. She graduated at the top of her class, and her final recital was dedicated to him. She called it the listening room. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, just her, a piano, and a story in every note. The crowd gave a standing ovation, but I knew, in her mind, she was playing for just one man. And I'm sure, wherever he was listening finally at peace, knowing that his silence had become a symphony. Years passed, but that house, my grandfather's house, never lost its melody. I moved in after college, not out of obligation, but because I felt drawn to the echoes that still lived there. I didn't change much. The piano remained exactly where it had always stood, centered beneath the stained glass window that lit up every morning like a stage. Sometimes I'd wake up before sunrise just to sit near it, coffee in hand, listening to the stillness. It was strange, even in silence. It felt like he was still composing, like every crack in the wood or creak in the floorboards was a leftover beat from a song unfinished. Eliza visited every year on the same day, the anniversary of her audition. Letter. She'd walk through the door, no need for words, and sit at the piano. One song, one afternoon, then she'd leave. But each time something new bloomed between us. A kind of understanding that only grows between people who have survived the same ache. Eventually, Eliza became a teacher. She didn't chase fame, even though she could have. She said, music should be taught by the wounded, not the perfect. Her students adored her. One day, she brought a group of them to the house, a field trip. She called it and asked if I'd tell them the story of the piano. I did. I told them about the man who built his life on silence, the nurse who opened a forbidden door, and the music that healed them both. The children were quiet afterward, unusually so. One of them asked, did he ever regret not playing all those years? I didn't have an answer then, but I do now, because I've learned that regret is just memory without motion. And my grandfather, in the end, chose motion, chose to listen, chose to let someone in, even when it hurt. That's not regret. That's redemption. That's grace, dressed in old robes and quiet pianos. One summer, Eliza stayed longer. The visits grew into weekends, weekends into weeks. And slowly, something unexpected began to take root. A relationship not born of romance, but of resilience. We laughed more, cooked together, sometimes argued over what tempo a particular song should have, but through it all, there was a gentleness between us, like the kind you find in old songs no one writes anymore. She'd begun restoring the sheet music he left behind, turning scribbled notes into full arrangements. I'd find her in the early hours, surrounded by papers, humming through a melody he'd never finished. And one night, she looked up and said, maybe this was the plan all along. Not for us to save him, but for him to bring us together. I didn't answer. I just sat beside her and played a few notes. She smiled. And for the first time, the house didn't feel like it belonged to the past. It felt like a stage for something still unfolding. The seasons continued their quiet rotation, as if orchestrated by an invisible conductor. Autumn brushing golden leaves against the windows. Winter draping the roof in solemn white spring. Waking the garden my grandmother once adored. And inside that old house, something remarkable happened. It never felt empty again. The piano, once a forbidden relic, became the center of everything. Students came from all over to hear Eliza teach, to feel the story in the room. And though many didn't know the full tale, they could sense it, the way you can hear sorrow in a song without knowing the lyrics. Some would place their hands on the piano gently, as if asking permission. Others would sit and play, their nervous fingers calmed by the atmosphere. And I would watch from the hallway, remembering the first time I saw her play, when my grandfather stood silent behind her, and everything began to change. One day, while organizing his old records, I came across something I hadn't seen before, a tape labeled for the one who listens. I knew immediately it was for Eliza. I brought it to her that evening, unsure what we'd hear. We played it together in the living room, hearts already too full. His voice came through the speaker, slow, tender. If you're hearing this, it means you listened, not just to the music, but to the silence, to the things I never said. I wasn't a kind man. I let pain speak for me far too long. But if I could ask for one thing, it would be this: pass it on, teach them to listen, teach them not to fear the quiet. We sat there, speechless, as his final message ended in a gentle piano outro, a lullaby, perhaps, or a farewell. Eliza didn't speak for a long while. Then she whispered, he wasn't just speaking to me, he was speaking to all of us. And I knew she was right. That tape became part of her curriculum. Every student, on their first day, had to listen to it, not as an assignment, but as an invitation. Listen like it matters, she'd say, because it always does. The impact was powerful. Students began writing songs that sounded like stories, compositions that felt like letters. Some even said they heard his voice in dreams. And Eliza, she glowed in that role, not as a performer, but as a guide. She had become everything my grandfather saw in her, and more. One afternoon, as we walked through the garden, now blooming with color and laughter, she turned to me and asked, do you think he'd be proud? I looked around at the home that had transformed from a mansion of grief into a sanctuary of sound and healing, and replied, no, I think he'd be overwhelmed. I think he'd cry. And maybe that's what he wanted all along, not to be remembered for his silence, but for the music it eventually set free. Block by block, note by note, that house became more than just a residence. It turned into a living inheritance, not in the financial sense, but as a space where generations could come, sit before a piano, and find themselves. There was something almost magical in the air, as if each breath carried fragments of the past, and every keystroke revived a hidden memory. Eliza had begun working on a book inspired by my grandfather's compositions. She titled it Keys to Silence, not just a collection of sheet music, but a tapestry of emotions, of turning points, of quiet lessons told through melodies only the heart could interpret. It was her way of honoring what she had been given, and sharing it with those who might otherwise never learn to listen. The book wasn't flashy or commercial, but those who read it, they changed. They started hearing life differently. One afternoon, a man arrived unannounced. He looked to be in his 50s, well-dressed, but clearly carrying something heavy. In his posture, he introduced himself as Victor, a former student of my grandfather from decades ago. He taught me composition before he retired from public life, he explained, but I never got to thank him. I've spent my whole life teaching music because of him. Eliza and I exchanged a glance, another ripple in the legacy neither of us had fully grasped. Victor sat at the piano, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. He once told me, Victor said, that every melody carries a secret, and every silence, a choice. He played one of my grandfather's earliest pieces, not perfectly, but with feeling. When he finished, Eliza placed a hand on his shoulder. "He heard you," she said, and in that moment, I believed it, not just as a comforting phrase, but as a truth. As the years moved on, more and more people found their way to the house. Former students, aspiring musicians, even complete strangers who had read Eliza's book or seen her play. They came not for the fame or the history, but for the feeling, that unshakable sense that within those four walls there was something sacred. Some brought instruments, others brought stories, and all left with something more. We hosted annual recitals in my grandfather's honor, but they didn't feel like performances. They felt like reunions between generations, between strangers, between grief and healing. And Eliza, she remained the soul of it all, never seeking recognition, only resonance. She often said, "You can't measure a life by applause, you measure it by the echoes it leaves behind." And if that's true, then my grandfather's life wasn't a quiet one after all. It was a symphony just waiting for someone to listen. Time did what it always does. It moved forward without asking for permission. Wrinkles deepened, seasons blended, and faces changed, but the music remained. Some days, I'd walk past the piano and swear I could still hear his voice, not in words, but in pauses, those thoughtful silences he used to leave between sentences. Eliza grew into her role like a tree growing into sunlight. She wasn't just a teacher or a musician anymore. She was a keeper of something sacred. People began referring to the house as the listening room, and not because it was quiet, but because it demanded presence. Phones stayed in pockets, voices lowered. Everyone who entered knew this wasn't a place to show off, it was a place to feel. We never asked them to respect the space. The space asked for it itself, by holding something invisible, yet undeniable. Then came a moment neither of us expected. Eliza, now well into her 40s, was offered a prestigious position at a renowned academy overseas, a dream job, the kind that most musicians chased their whole lives. But when she told me, her voice wasn't filled with excitement. It was laced with conflict. "What if I lose this?" she asked, motioning to the house, to everything we'd built together. "What if this doesn't exist somewhere else?" I understood her fear. This wasn't just a job, it was a legacy. But I also knew that my grandfather's message to never stop playing was never about location. It was about courage. "Go," I told her. "Take it. What you built here doesn't vanish just because you leave. It echoes." She cried that night, not because she was sad, but because she finally believed it. The music didn't belong to a house, it belonged to her, and it was time for the world to hear it. Before she left, we recorded one final performance together, just the two of us. No audience, no microphones, just a dusty room, an old piano, and two people who had been shaped by the same man in different ways. We played one of my grandfather's lost pieces, unfinished, raw, beautiful. When we reached the final measure, we stopped, left it unresolved, just like he always had. "Let someone else finish it," she said. And I smiled, because I finally understood. Life doesn't wrap itself up in neat endings. It leaves notes hanging in the air, waiting for the next soul brave enough to listen. Eliza left for Europe that winter, and though the house felt quieter, it never felt empty, because she hadn't really left. She had simply passed the melody forward, and that's what great stories do. They continue, in keys and hearts we never expect. In the years that followed, I remained in the house, not as a guardian of history, but as a participant in its unfolding. Students still came, letters still arrived, and the piano, old and slightly out of tune, kept singing, even in the silence. I began hosting open evenings once a month. Anyone could come. No stage, no pressure, just people, a bench, and a piano waiting for someone to sit and try. Some were brilliant, others were clumsy, but every performance mattered, because each person who touched those keys wasn't just playing music. They were continuing a conversation, a dialogue between generations, between the living and the gone, between fear and courage. One boy, no older than 8, once played 3 notes and broke down crying. When I asked him why, he said, "I don't know. It just felt like someone was listening." And I knew exactly what he meant. Eliza and I continued to write. Emails turned into letters, letters into long-distance calls, filled with laughter and the occasional tears. She told me about her students, how some of them reminded her of herself, hungry to be heard but terrified to speak. And she told them the same thing my grandfather told her: don't just play louder, play truer. Her teachings weren't about perfection. They were about presence, about listening to the spaces between notes and trusting that silence had something to say. One day she sent me a manuscript, her second book. It was titled The Space Between. It wasn't about technique, it was about life, about how all of us are compositions in progress, and how sometimes the pauses, the grief, the doubt, the fear are the very parts that give our stories meaning. I read it in one sitting, tears running down my face, realizing it wasn't just about music. It was about him, about her, about me. And in those moments, I finally accepted something I had resisted for years. I had become part of the melody too, not as a background note, not as an echo, but as a verse in the song my grandfather began long before I was born. It humbled me, because I had always seen myself as the observer, the narrator, the one who watched others carry the legacy. But now, I understood I was carrying it too, not with grand compositions or sold-out recitals, but with consistency, with listening, with holding the space where others could unfold. That house wasn't special because of its architecture. It was special because people came in broken and left believing they had something to offer. That was his real legacy. Not the wealth, not the recordings, not the honors. It was the courage to invite others into the silence and let them discover that they belonged there too. As time passed, the story of my grandfather and Eliza began to spread in ways we never planned. A journalist heard about the listening room and wrote a small piece about it. Just a column buried in the middle of a Sunday paper, but somehow it resonated. People began showing up from out of state, from across the country. Some came with sheet music, others with nothing but questions. One woman stood at the threshold for 10 minutes before stepping in and whispering, "I don't play, but I lost my husband, and I just wanted to be somewhere that understands silence." I didn't need to say anything. I just led her to the window bench and let the piano do the speaking. That's how it always worked. The house never needed words to comfort. It carried a presence. And anyone who walked in, whether a virtuoso or a grieving widow, felt it immediately. One particularly cold January evening, as the wind howled through the trees outside, I received a package. It was from Eliza. Inside was a letter, a flash drive, and a photograph. The letter explained that she had composed her first full symphony inspired by my grandfather's life, and it was going to debut in Vienna that spring. The photograph was of the concert hall, still empty, but she had written on the back, "He'll be sitting in the front row." I just know it. I played the file on the flash drive, expecting something grand, maybe cinematic, but what I heard made my heart stop. It began with a single note, the very first note she had ever played on his piano all those years ago. Then came the pauses, the hesitations, the courage gathering. The entire first movement was built around that memory, and by the second, it bloomed into something that felt like rising from grief, into hope. I sat in the dark, eyes closed, letting it wash over me. I knew then that the story was no longer ours. It had escaped the walls of the house and was now living in others, in the hearts of strangers who would never meet my grandfather, who would never hear his gruff voice or see his stubborn smile, but who would feel him just the same. That's what music does. It transcends memory. It becomes something more than recollection. It becomes inheritance. And I finally saw how complete the circle had become. My grandfather had lost his voice to grief. Eliza gave it back to him through music, and now, through her, and through me, and through every person who touched those keys, his story would never fade. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. And the truth, when played with sincerity, never dies. It just keeps echoing into ears willing to listen. Spring arrived with an almost cinematic gentleness, as if the world itself had paused for a moment to exhale. The garden bloomed early that year, tulips and lilacs spreading their color like applause across the lawn. It felt like a sign. I opened the windows wide, let the breeze wander through the house, and placed fresh flowers on the piano, just like my grandmother used to do. The recital in Vienna was approaching fast, and I had already booked a flight. Eliza insisted I sit in the front row, that I'd be there to witness what we had all unknowingly helped build. But before I left, I invited one last group of students into the house. They were young, most barely out of high school, full of talent and ego, nervousness and dreams. I told them the story, all of it, from the first note Eliza ever played, to the final composition that was now being brought to life on the other side of the world. One student raised his hand and asked, what made her stay, back then, when she got caught? The question surprised me. I hadn't thought about that moment in a long time. Because, I said slowly, he didn't punish her for breaking the rule. He rewarded her for breaking the silence. The room went quiet. Some looked at the piano as if it had just spoken, and maybe it had, because that was always the lesson, that what we're afraid to touch is often the very thing that sets us free. I let each student play a few bars of their favorite song. Some were classical, others were wild jazz or hesitant original pieces, but every single one of them played like the moment mattered. And when they left, I sat at the piano myself, placed my hands on the keys, and whispered, thank you, not just to him, not just to Eliza, but to the silence that had taught me how to listen. The night before my flight to Vienna, I found myself walking the halls of the house like I used to when I was a boy. Each room held echoes, not ghosts, but gifts. The couch, where my grandfather used to fall asleep listening to Eliza, the corner where her music stand once stood, the rug stained with candle wax from a forgotten night of celebration. None of it was sad. It was sacred. I realized then that this was never just a house, or a piano, or a story about two people. It was about what happens when we stop guarding our wounds and start offering them. About how healing isn't a performance, but a quiet, persistent melody that invites others to join in. I packed my things slowly, carefully, and just before zipping the final bag, I placed the original letter my grandfather wrote to Eliza inside my coat pocket. I didn't need it for the concert. I needed it to remind myself. Stories don't end. They just change keys. Vienna felt like a dream painted in real colors. Cobblestone streets echoing with centuries of music, golden sunlight dancing through cathedral windows, and a concert hall that seemed to breathe with its own kind of reverence. The night of the premiere arrived with a quiet gravity. The hall filled slowly, but respectfully, as if every person instinctively knew they weren't just attending a performance. They were entering a story. I sat in the front row, just as Eliza had asked, clutching my grandfather's letter in my coat pocket. The lights dimmed, the stage grew silent, and then she appeared poised, calm, yet glowing with something far beyond confidence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply nodded toward the orchestra, and they began. The first note was soft, familiar. The second, bolder. And by the third, I was crying because I knew what this was. This wasn't just a symphony. It was his life, stitched into sound. The piece moved through movements like memories, the youthful energy of ambition, the dissonance of grief, the aching stillness of regret. And then, the release, a final crescendo that felt like sunrise breaking through years of cloud. There were no lyrics, but the story was unmistakable. I watched as the musicians gave themselves fully to the notes, and as Eliza conducted, her hands moved like someone painting the air with truth. In that moment, I saw her not as the nurse who once dared to touch a forbidden piano, but as the woman who had carried an entire man's silence on her back and turned it into a voice the world could hear. When the final note fell into silence, the hall stayed still, not out of hesitation but out of awe. Then, as if breaking from a trance, the crowd rose. Thunderous applause, cheers, and still, she just stood there, hands down, head bowed, eyes closed. She didn't need their approval. She had already heard the only applause that mattered, his. After the performance, we met backstage. She was exhausted, but alive in a way I had never seen. "Did he hear it?" she asked, eyes full of something deeper than hope. I pulled the letter from my coat and handed it to her. "He wrote this, for you, years ago. I was saving it for the right moment." Her hands trembled as she opened it. She didn't read it out loud. She didn't need to. I watched her eyes scan the page, then close slowly as she pressed the paper to her chest. We didn't say much after that, just held each other for a moment, like the story itself had exhaled. That night, as I lay in my hotel bed, the melody still dancing in my ears, I realized something. The piano back home would never sound the same, not because it had changed, but because now we had, and that was the real finale. Returning home after Vienna felt like stepping back into the arms of an old friend, familiar, comforting, and quietly waiting. The house welcomed me not with words, but with the creak of the floorboards, the scent of old paper and wood polish, and the golden dust caught dancing in the afternoon sun. I walked straight to the piano, not to play, but to listen. I sat before it, placed my hands on the keys, and just breathed. Everything felt different now. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, not with sorrow, but with legacy. Eliza's symphony had awakened something in the world, but more importantly, it had completed something in me. I wasn't the boy watching from the hallway anymore. I was the man carrying the story forward, not out of duty, but out of devotion. I finally understood what my grandfather had meant when he said, "Don't protect the silence, protect the music inside it." In the weeks that followed, letters poured in from people who had heard the symphony, some from strangers, others from former students, and many from young musicians who said the music had touched something they didn't have words for. A small envelope arrived from Vienna. Inside was a single sheet of music, handwritten by Eliza. A new piece, the title, Keys to Home. No message, no explanation, just notes waiting to be played. I sat at the piano, unfolded the page, and played it slowly. It was soft, nostalgic, and honest. It sounded like her, like here, like us. As the final note echoed, I realized the song wasn't finished. She had left it open-ended, another invitation, another space for me to add something of my own, and so I did. I added a single note, the first one she had ever played here. As the closing tone, a full circle, built not by design, but by truth. I sent it back to her with a message, "Let's keep writing." That became our tradition. Every year, on the anniversary of that first piano moment, we send each other one page of music, unfinished, open, honest, and we continued the composition. It's never published, never performed, it's just ours. A living letter written in notes across oceans and time zones, across decades of grief and healing. And the house, it's still alive. Children come to learn, elderly visitors come to remember, and I, most days, just sit near the piano, sometimes playing, sometimes not, but always listening, because that's the lesson my grandfather left us, that the most powerful stories don't scream, they whisper. And if we're still enough, quiet enough, and brave enough to listen, we'll find that music is everywhere. In the laughter of a stranger, in the pauses of a conversation, in the heartbeats between heartbreak and healing. That's where the symphony lives, not in concert halls, but in us. I often wonder what my grandfather would say if he could walk through this house now, if he could see the piano surrounded by students, the garden blooming again, the walls breathing with laughter instead of loneliness. I think he wouldn't say much. He never needed many words. He would sit quietly in his old chair, maybe close his eyes while Eliza played, and just smile. Because this, all of this, was never about the music itself. It was about what the music revealed. The courage to touch what felt untouchable. The strength to listen even when it hurts. The beauty of letting someone in, even if they might leave. That's what he gave us. Not a fortune, not fame, but a melody that keeps playing in every life he touched. His story became Eliza's. Eliza's became mine. And now, maybe it becomes yours too. Because if you've made it this far, if you've listened closely, then a piece of this music lives in you now. So wherever you are, whoever you are, sit down at your own piano. Not a real one, necessarily, but whatever version of it exists in your life. That dream you buried, that silence you've avoided, that part of you that longs to be heard but fears it's too late. Touch it gently, even if your hands shake. Play a note, even if it's wrong. Because sometimes, the most beautiful songs begin with a mistake, with someone daring to do the thing they were never given permission for. Just like Eliza did, just like my grandfather finally allowed. And when you do, you might discover that what you thought was forbidden was actually sacred. That the silence wasn't there to punish you, it was waiting for your courage, waiting for your voice, waiting for your story. Because maybe, just maybe, your melody is the one someone else has been aching to hear their whole life. And if you're still holding on to that question, what happens after the final note? Let me offer you the only answer I've found. There is no final note, only transitions, only modulations, only the quiet invitation to keep going, to keep writing, to keep listening. The story doesn't end because the house grows quiet. It lives on in echoes, in memories, in the trembling hands of someone who dares to play again. That's what my grandfather taught me. That's what Eliza reminded me. And that's what I now offer to you. Wherever you go, whatever you face, don't guard your silence. Share your song. Let it be unfinished. Let it be raw, but let it be heard. Because in a world full of noise, the ones who truly listen carry the power to change everything.